The crystal chandeliers of the Plaza Hotel ballroom cast fractured light across 400 faces that Robert Brennan no longer recognized. 23 years changes everything: the architecture of power, the currency of reputation, the very language of ambition. Rob stood at the mahogany bar, nursing overpriced scotch he couldn't afford, watching men half his age negotiate deals that would have seemed reckless in his era, but now passed for visionary. The tuxedo hung loose on his frame rental fabric that whispered its temporary claim to elegance with every movement. Security hadn't questioned his entrance. The old membership credentials, laminated relics from 1999, still carried ghost authority in their database, a clerical oversight that felt almost like providence. Across the ballroom, Victor Ashford accepted his award with practiced humility, the kind that comes from media coaching rather than genuine modesty. Lifetime achievement in financial innovation. The irony burned hotter than the scotch. Rob studied the man who'd once sat across from him in a cramped office on Fifth Avenue, eager and brilliant and hungrier than anyone Rob had ever mentored. Victor's hair had grayed at the temples, distinguished silver that probably cost more to maintain than Rob's monthly rent. The Brioni suit fit like architecture. Wedding ring number 3 caught the light as Victor gestured, thanking mentors he carefully didn't name. The speech rolled out in waves of platitude: ethical leadership, fiduciary responsibility, the sacred trust between advisor and client. Each phrase landed like a blade between Rob's ribs, not because they hurt, but because they'd been hollowed out, turned into weapons that cut only one way. The audience applauded. Rob set down his glass and moved through the crowd with the invisibility that comes naturally to men his age, especially men whose names once meant something, but now carry only the faint stink of scandal. Victor finished his speech to standing ovation. Photographers swarmed. Rob waited at the edge of the light, patient in the way that 23 years of exile teaches. The crowd thinned as guests migrated toward the silent auction tables. Victor turned, scanning for his next conversation, and his eyes passed over Rob without recognition. That hurt more than Rob expected. Not the lack of memory Victor remembered that was certain, but the theatrical quality of the dismissal, as if Rob had become transparent through sheer irrelevance. Rob stepped closer. His voice came out steady, a small victory. "Hello, Victor." The name landed like a stone in still water. Victor's face went through a progression of micro-expressions: surprise, calculation, fear quickly suppressed, then the mask sliding back into place with professional smoothness. "Robert, my God, I didn't realize you'd be here. The Plaza doesn't check pedigrees at the door anymore. Standards have fallen." Victor's laugh came too quickly, too loud. "How have you been?" "It's been, what, 20 years, 23. But who's counting?" The silence stretched between them, dense with history that couldn't be spoken in this room among these people under these lights. Other guests drifted closer, sensing the tension without understanding its source. Victor's wife, the third, Mrs. Ashford, a former model whose name Rob had seen in society columns, materialized at her husband's elbow with the timing of someone trained to extract him from uncomfortable situations. "Darling, the senator is asking for you." Victor seized the escape. "Of course, Rob. We should catch up sometime. Really talk. It's good to see you looking well." The lie hung between them, obvious and unchallenged. Rob didn't look well. He looked like what he was: a man approaching retirement with nothing to retire from, wearing borrowed dignity and secondhand purpose. But Victor was already moving away, his wife's hand on his arm, surrounded again by the gravitational field of success that pulled people into his orbit. Rob watched him go, then reached into his jacket pocket and pressed record on the small digital recorder Catherine Wells had given him. "Just in case," she'd said. "Just in case Victor says something useful." Rob had laughed at the time. Victor wouldn't confess at a gala. Criminals didn't monologue outside of bad television. But the recorder was running now, capturing ambient sound, time-stamping Rob's presence in this room at this moment. Not because Victor would confess, but because evidence was cumulative, built from tiny fragments that eventually formed mountains. Rob had learned patience. It was the one skill that 23 years of failure taught absolutely. He left the gala before dessert was served, walking out into Manhattan night that felt colder than the temperature warranted. The subway ride back to Queens took 45 minutes, carrying him through layers of the city that stratified by wealth and language and dream. By the time Rob climbed the 3 flights to his studio apartment, exhaustion had settled into his bones with familiar weight. The apartment was exactly as he'd left it, small, clean, organized with the precision of someone who owned few enough possessions to care about placement. Books lined one wall, mostly financial theory and case studies, the kind of dense academic text that no one read for pleasure. Rob's laptop sat on the folding table that served as desk and dining surface. He opened it and began typing notes about the gala, documenting Victor's presence, the award, the brief conversation. Nothing dramatic, just records that might matter later or might not matter at all. His phone rang at 11:30. Sarah's name on the screen brought a small warmth to his chest. "Hey, honey." Her voice carried stress underneath the greeting. "Dad, did I wake you? You know I don't sleep before midnight. What's wrong?" She hesitated, and in that pause, Rob heard the shape of the problem before she spoke it. "I found something at work, an irregularity in a deal we're analyzing." "Dad, it's Victor Ashford's fund." Rob's hand tightened on the phone. "Tell me, not over the phone, can we meet for lunch tomorrow, that French place on Columbus, Aura? If this is what I think it is tomorrow, please. I need to show you documents, and I need you to tell me I'm not crazy. Or if I am crazy, I need you to tell me that too." Rob agreed, knowing sleep would be impossible now. After they hung up, he sat in darkness, watching headlights track across his ceiling from the street below. Sarah had found something. His daughter, brilliant and careful, working at Sterling Capital, with no connection to Rob's past except blood, had independently stumbled into Victor Ashford's orbit and seen the patterns. History didn't repeat. That was Twain's line, or a paraphrase of it. History rhymed, and Rob could hear the rhythm starting again, the same meter that had destroyed him in 2002, but played in a different key with different instruments, and the terrible possibility that this time finally the melody would resolve. Morning came slowly. Rob went through his routine with mechanical precision: coffee shower, the walk to Angelo's Deli, where he met with small business owners who needed help understanding their own books. Angelo Marchetti had receipts spread across the table when Rob arrived, worry creasing his face into deeper valleys. "These supplier invoices, Rob. The prices keep going up, but my margins keep shrinking. Something's not adding up." Rob spent an hour with the numbers, finding the problem in patterns that Angelo couldn't see because he trusted the wrong person. "Your nephew's been inflating supplier costs and pocketing the difference. About 30,000 over 2 years. Angelo's face collapsed. "Tony. But his mother, my sister, I know. Family makes it harder. But business is survival. You confront him, offer to forget it if the money comes back and the theft stops. Or you prosecute. Those are your options." Angelo chose mercy, as Rob knew he would. Families were complicated, and $30,000 wasn't worth destroying relationships that stretched back generations. Rob collected his $150 fee and moved to his next appointment, running the routine that paid rent and bought groceries and accumulated slowly in a savings account that never quite reached the threshold of security. The French bistro where he met Sarah cost more than Rob usually spent on a week of meals. But Sarah had chosen it, and Sarah was paying, so Rob ordered the prix-fixe menu and tried not to calculate the markup on ingredients he could have purchased for a fifth of the price. Sarah arrived exactly on time, carrying her leather portfolio and wearing the kind of controlled anxiety that came from carrying secrets that weighed more than their physical dimensions suggested. She kissed his cheek and sat down, her movements precise. They ordered. Small talk felt impossible, so Rob waited while Sarah organized her thoughts with the methodical approach that had carried her through Harvard and Wharton and 6 years climbing Sterling Capital's hierarchy. Finally, she pulled out her tablet. "Dad, Sterling is considering a limited partnership in Millennium Fund, Victor Ashford's flagship vehicle. Due diligence landed on my desk 3 weeks ago. Returns have been incredible, 22% annually for 5 years. But when I started verifying the underlying assets, things didn't match." She showed him spreadsheets, comparison tables, documentation that revealed the architecture of something wrong. Reported valuations versus independent appraisals. Cash flow statements with irregular patterns. An auditor based in Delaware that Rob recognized from other cases firms that existed primarily to provide plausible deniability for clients who needed official stamps on questionable numbers. Rob studied the data with the muscle memory of skills that never quite atrophied despite years away from high-level analysis. Sarah was right. The patterns were there, subtle but distinctive, like a signature in invisible ink that only showed under the right light. Victor was running something not necessarily a Ponzi scheme in the classic sense, but definitely a structure where reported performance diverged significantly from actual results. What did your boss say when you brought this up? Sarah's jaw tightened. Shut me down. Said Millennium Fund is elite, has proprietary strategies we can't expect to fully understand at our level. Told me to focus on other projects and stop wasting time on conspiracy theories. But you kept digging. Of course I kept digging. The numbers are wrong, Dad. I can prove it. And if Sterling invests $50 million in this fund based on fraudulent performance data, we're complicit. I'm complicit. I can't let that happen. Rob set down his fork, appetite gone. Sarah, you need to understand what you're walking into. Victor Ashford doesn't just fight back when challenged. He destroys. Systematically. Permanently. He did it to me 23 years ago, and he's had 2 decades to perfect his techniques. You think I should drop it? I think you should be absolutely certain before you commit. Because once you start this fight, there's no retreat. Only victory or destruction. Those are the outcomes. Sarah met his eyes. I'm certain. I've triple-checked every calculation. This is fraud, Dad. And you were right about him all along. No one believed you then, but I believe you now. So let's prove it together. The waiter brought their entrees. Rob pushed food around his plate while his mind worked through implications and strategies and the terrible risks that Sarah was volunteering to take. She was 28 years old with her whole career ahead of her. Exposing Victor meant becoming a target. Whistleblowers rarely emerged unscathed, regardless of whether their allegations proved accurate. But Sarah was also her father's daughter. She had his stubbornness and his inability to ignore wrongdoing, even when ignorance would be safer. Rob recognized the set of her jaw because he'd seen it in mirrors for 23 years. She'd made her decision. Now the only question was whether Rob would help or try to protect her by refusing, knowing she'd proceed regardless. Tell me everything you found. Every detail. We're going to need to be perfect on this. They spent 3 hours in the restaurant until the lunch crowd cleared and the staff began setting tables for dinner. Sarah showed him documents she'd accumulated, analyses she'd run, dead ends she'd encountered. Rob added context from his own investigation, the 5 years he'd spent quietly tracking Victor's operations, building evidence that no one would accept from a discredited source. But that might carry weight if corroborated by independent analysis from someone with Sarah's credentials. By the time they left, they had the skeleton of a case. Not enough for prosecution, not even enough for definitive proof, but enough to know they were looking at something real, something criminal, something that would hurt thousands of people if allowed to continue unchallenged. Rob walked Sarah to the subway station. Before she descended into the underground, she hugged him tighter than usual. Be careful, Dad. I have a bad feeling Victor already knows something's wrong. That I've been asking questions. What makes you think that Sarah pulled back, her expression troubled? My apartment building. There's been a van parked across the street for 3 days. Same van, different drivers, but same vehicle. Could be coincidence, could be nothing, but it feels like surveillance. Rob felt ice crystallize in his chest. Did you call the police and tell them what? That I think someone might be watching me because I'm investigating financial fraud that I can't prove yet. They'd write it off as paranoia. She was right, but that didn't make the situation less dangerous. Rob made her promise to be careful, to vary her routines, to trust her instincts if anything felt wrong. Then he watched her disappear into the subway before heading back to Queens on foot, needing the time to think. Victor knew something. That surveillance wasn't coincidence. Someone had flagged Sarah's questions, reported her digging to Victor's network, and now she was being watched. The machinery of protection that Victor had built around his empire was already engaging, identifying threats and preparing responses. Rob had seen this before 23 years ago when he tried to report irregularities and found himself suddenly isolated, accused, destroyed. Back in his apartment, Rob made a call to a number he had been saving for years. Catherine Wells answered on the third ring. Her voice carried the permanent skepticism of someone who'd been a journalist long enough to trust nothing at face value. Catherine, it's Robert Brennan. We spoke a few years ago about Victor Ashford. I remember. You had interesting theories but no proof. Has that situation changed? My daughter just independently discovered evidence of fraud in Millennium Fund. She's being surveilled. I need help building a case that will actually stick this time. Silence on the line, then I'm expensive. My retainer is $25,000, and that's just a start. I have $8,000 in savings. My daughter will cover the rest if necessary. This isn't about money. This is about stopping Victor before he destroys more lives, including hers. Another pause. Then Catherine's voice came back with a different quality, less businesslike and more personal. I never forgot your case, Robert. The story I couldn't publish because legal killed it. If your daughter's found new evidence and she's willing to stake her career on it, then maybe this time we can actually bring him down. I'll take your $8,000 as a down payment. Send me everything you both have. I'll start building the investigative framework. They arranged to meet the following week. Rob hung up feeling simultaneously hopeful and terrified hope that finally, after 23 years, he might have the resources and allies to challenge Victor effectively. Terror that Sarah was now in the same position he'd been in 2002, young and idealistic, and convinced that truth would triumph over power. The next 3 days passed in tense normalcy. Rob worked his consulting jobs. Sarah went to her office at Sterling Capital and maintained the appearance of focusing on other projects while secretly feeding information to Rob and Catherine. No one broke into Sarah's apartment. No direct threats materialized. But the surveillance van remained, and that constant presence felt like a countdown to something worse. On Thursday evening, Rob received a call from an unknown number. Male voice, professional tone, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who made difficult phone calls for a living. Robert Brennan speaking. Message from Victor Ashford. Stop your investigation immediately. Stop encouraging your daughter to pursue baseless allegations. If you don't cease this harassment within 24 hours, Mr. Ashford will be forced to take legal action for defamation and to report concerns about your daughter's professional conduct to appropriate authorities at Sterling Capital. Do you understand? Rob's hand tightened on the phone. Tell Victor that truth isn't defamation, and tell him I'm not stopping. Mr. Brennan, I strongly advise you to reconsider. Mr. Ashford has substantial resources, and I know exactly what resources Victor has. I helped him build some of them. He can use whatever weapons he wants. I'm not stopping. Rob hung up. His hands shook slightly as he forwarded the call details to Catherine, documenting the threat. Then he called Weira to warn her. But Sarah's phone went to voicemail. Rob tried again. Voicemail, a third time. Voicemail. Panic rising, Rob grabbed his jacket and headed for the subway. Sarah's apartment was in Brooklyn, 45 minutes away. Rob made it in 35, running up the stairs of her building and pounding on her door. No answer. He tried the knob. Locked. Used the emergency key Sarah had given him years ago. The apartment was empty, but clearly disrupted. Papers scattered across her dining table. Laptop open, screen dark. Sarah's purse on the counter, but her phone gone. Rob called her office. After hours voicemail. Called Sterling Capital's main line. Security desk answered. Rob identified himself as Sarah's father and asked if she was working late. The guard checked logs. No, sir. Ms. Brennan left at her normal time, 5:30. Rob hung up and called Catherine. Sarah's missing. I'm at her apartment. Signs of disruption, but no violence. Phone's going to voicemail. How long since you last spoke to her? Is 3 hours. That's not long enough to file a missing person report. But given the circumstances, we should assume Victor's escalating. Stay there. I'm sending someone to do a security sweep of the apartment. Don't touch anything else. Rob sat on Sarah's couch in darkness, waiting. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Image attachment. Rob opened it and his blood turned to ice. The photo showed Sarah in what looked like a storage facility or warehouse. She was tied to a chair, visible fear in her eyes, but no obvious injuries. Below the image, a message. Your daughter is unharmed. She will remain that way if you and Catherine Wells immediately cease all investigation into Millennium Fund and destroy all evidence you have collected. You have 12 hours to comply. Instructions will follow. Do not contact police. Do not attempt to locate her. Any deviation from instructions will result in consequences neither of you want to contemplate. V. Rob stared at the screen, mind racing through options that all ended badly. Call police and risk Victor harming Sarah. Try to locate her himself and almost certainly fail. comply with demands, and abandon the only chance to stop Victor while condemning Sarah to whatever fate Victor decided anyway. The apartment door opened. Catherine entered with two others, a man and woman, both moving with the controlled efficiency of people with tactical training. Catherine took one look at Rob's face and knew. What happened? Rob showed her the phone. Catherine studied the image with professional detachment, zooming in on details, analyzing background elements. Then she forwarded it to someone on her team with a message Rob couldn't see. The woman introduced herself. Alex Chen, former FBI. We're going to find your daughter, Mr. Brennan. But right now, I need you to tell me everything about Victor's properties, his patterns, anywhere he might take someone he wanted to keep hidden. Rob forced his mind into analytical mode, pushing panic down through sheer discipline. Victor owned his primary residence in Greenwich, Connecticut, a penthouse in Manhattan, likely other properties through shell companies, but Rob didn't know the current full list. Victor traveled frequently but preferred staying in luxury hotels rather than maintaining vacation homes. What about associates, security personnel? Who does his dirty work? Rob described what he knew in information mostly outdated, but Catherine and Alex took notes anyway, building profiles and possibility maps. The male member of Catherine's team worked on Sarah's laptop, trying to trace her last digital movements, looking for patterns in her recent searches that might indicate where she'd been investigating. After an hour, Alex straightened from examining the apartment. No signs of struggle here. Either she left voluntarily with someone she trusted, or she was taken somewhere else and brought to the current location afterward. The photo background shows industrial space, concrete walls, metal fixtures, could be storage unit, could be warehouse, could be basement of commercial building. We've sent the image to a specialist who analyzes architectural details. Might narrow location. How long will that take? 12 to 24 hours. We don't have 24 hours. We have 12 before Victor's deadline. Catherine met his eyes. Then we assume we're not getting location help in time. We need to draw Victor out, force him to reveal where Sarah is, or make a mistake that exposes his position. And we need to do it in a way that doesn't trigger him to harm her. How we give him what he wants, or appear to. Rob, you're going to call that number and tell Victor you're complying. Destroying evidence, ceasing investigation, whatever he wants to hear. Buy time for us to work. And if Victor doesn't believe me, then we improvise. But right now, time is the asset we need most. Rob made the call, unknown number from the text. It rang 4 times before Victor answered, his voice carrying satisfaction that made Rob's stomach turn. Robert, I'm glad you're being reasonable. I want proof Sarah's okay. Let me talk to her. Not yet. First, you confirm compliance. Have you destroyed the evidence you and Catherine Wells collected? Rob looked at Catherine, who nodded. Yes, all of it. Hard drives, wiped documents, shredded everything, gone. And your daughter's files from Sterling Capital, she'll delete them as soon as you release her. Victor laughed the sound cold. Robert, I'm disappointed. You think I'm amateur? Sarah's files are already gone. I have people at Sterling Capital. Her computer was remotely accessed and wiped 3 hours ago. Same with her backup drives. The evidence no longer exists outside my control. Then you have what you want. Let Sarah go. Not yet. First, I need insurance that you won't immediately restart your pathetic investigation the moment she's safe. You're going to sign a document admitting that you fabricated these allegations out of obsessive vendetta, that you manipulated your daughter into believing your delusions, that you accept full responsibility for defaming me and agree to never make public accusations again. My lawyers are preparing the document now. Once signed and notarized, Sarah will be released unharmed. Rob's jaw clenched. And if I refuse, then you never see her again. Simple. You have until morning to decide, Robert. And I suggest you choose quickly because my patience with you ended 23 years ago. The line went dead. Rob looked at Catherine and her team. Victor's not releasing Sarah just for destroying evidence. He wants signed confession, document that would legally bind me and discredit anything we tried to do afterward. Alex spoke up. Then we don't wait for his timeline. We find Sarah ourselves, Mr. Brennan think. Victor's arrogant, but he's not stupid. He wouldn't take her somewhere connected to him that could be traced back. He'd use a location that's secure but deniable. Think about his business operations. Storage facilities for documents, properties owned by shell companies, places he'd have access to without direct ownership. Rob closed his eyes, forcing memory to surface. Years ago, when they'd still been partners, Victor had mentioned using storage facilities for archived client files, someplace in Brooklyn. Industrial area. What was the name? Rob couldn't pull it, but he remembered the general area Red Hook near the waterfront before the neighborhood gentrified. Red Hook has dozens of storage facilities. That's still too broad. Catherine pulled up maps on her tablet. We start with facilities large enough to have private units, old enough to have minimal security, close enough to Manhattan for Victor to access easily, but remote enough for privacy. That narrows it to maybe 5 locations. And if we're wrong, then we've wasted time we don't have. But sitting here waiting for Victor's deadline doesn't save Sarah either. At least this gives us action. They left Sarah's apartment in 2 cars, Catherine, Rob, and Alex in one vehicle, the rest of Catherine's team in another, racing toward Red Hook with the desperate hope that Rob's fragmentary memory and Catherine's analytical process would converge on the right location before Victor's deadline expired or his patience ran out. The first facility was wrong too. New, too secure, no unit matching the background details from Sarah's photo. The second was locked down for the night with security guard who wouldn't budge without warrant. The third had been converted to artist studios. Catherine's architectural analyst called with an update. The photos showed specific ceiling fixtures that suggested construction from the 1970s industrial rather than commercial grade. That eliminated 2 more locations. They reached the final possibility at 3 in the morning. Legacy Storage Solutions, a sprawling complex of connected warehouse buildings that dated back to when Red Hook was purely industrial. Minimal exterior lighting. Chain link fence with old lock that Alex bypassed in under 30 seconds. They moved through the complex, carefully checking buildings, looking for any sign of occupation. In the third building, Rob saw light leaking from beneath a roll-up door. He gestured to the others. They approached silently, Alex taking point with the kind of confidence that came from extensive tactical training. She listened at the door, then used a small mirror to check underneath. Whispered back, one person visible. Seated. Could be Sarah. Catherine made a call speaking quietly to someone on her team. Then she nodded to Alex. Police are 5 minutes out. We hold position until they arrive. But holding position meant trusting that whoever was guarding Sarah wouldn't hurt her in those 5 minutes. Rob's hands clenched into fists, every instinct screaming to act. Then headlights swept across the building. Not police. Black SUV pulling up to the very door they were watching. Victor Ashford stepped out, alone on the barn. He approached the roll-up door and knocked twice, some kind of signal. The door rolled up from inside. Light spilled out, illuminating the storage unit interior. Sarah sat tied to a chair exactly as the photo had shown. One guard stood nearby holding a pistol. Victor stepped inside and his voice carried in the quiet night. Has anyone attempted contact? The guard shook his head. No, sir. It's been quiet. Good. Because in about 4 hours, Robert is going to sign my document, and then this problem goes away permanently. You're going to release her. Victor turned to look at Sarah, and even from outside, Rob could see the cold calculation in his former protege's expression. Of course not. She knows too much. She's seen too much. But Robert will believe I'm releasing her right up until the moment her body is found, and by then it will be too late for him to do anything about it. Tragic accident. Distraught young woman depressed about work stress took her own life. Happens all the time. Sarah's eyes widened with fear. Victor, you can't. Victor moved fast, striking her across the face. Don't speak. You lost that privilege when you decided to help your pathetic father destroy everything I've built. You should have stayed out of this, Sarah. You could have had a good career. Instead, you chose family loyalty over intelligence. Fatal mistake. Rob lunged forward, but Alex caught his arm, holding him back with surprising strength. Police are 90 seconds out. Don't blow this. 90 seconds felt infinite. Rob watched Victor check his watch. Watched the guard shift position. Watched Sarah struggle against ropes that wouldn't give. Then sirens cut through the night, closed and getting closer. Victor's head snapped toward the sound. His face transformed with rage. Police! Someone called the police! How? The guard looked panicked. I don't know, sir. No one's been here. Doesn't matter. Victor pulled out his phone. We're leaving. Kill her and let's go. The guard raised his pistol toward Sarah. Rob broke free from Alex's grip and ran forward, shouting wordlessly. The guard spun toward the noise. Victor saw Rob and his expression twisted into something between triumph and fury. Robert, of course, you couldn't just take the deal, could you? Always have to be the hero. Police burst through multiple entrances simultaneously, weapons drawn, commands shouting over each other. Freeze, drop the weapon. Hands up, the guard hesitated, gun still pointed in Sarah's direction. Victor raised his hand slowly, already calculating his next move, but his eyes stayed locked on Rob with pure hatred. The guard made the wrong choice. He started to lower his weapon towards Sarah. Multiple officers fired. The guard went down. Victor dove for cover behind a storage container. More gunfire. Sarah screamed. Rob ran to her, untying ropes with shaking hands, pulling her away from the chaos as police swarmed the space. It took 20 minutes to secure the scene. The guard was dead killed in the exchange of fire. Victor was in custody, handcuffed and screaming about illegal search and harassment and lawyers. Sarah clung to Rob, trembling but unharmed. Catherine appeared at Rob's shoulder, looking grim but satisfied. We got him. Kidnapping, attempted murder, conspiracy. Even with his lawyers, Victor's not walking away from this. Rob held Sarah tighter, relief and exhaustion washing over him in waves that threatened to buckle his knees. Around them, police worked the scene, photographing, collecting evidence, taking statements. The nightmare was ending finally after 23 years. Not with redemption or vindication, but with survival, which was its own kind of victory. The FBI field office in Lower Manhattan smelled like burnt coffee and bureaucratic exhaustion. Rob sat in an interview room with pale green walls, answering questions for the fourth consecutive hour, while fluorescent lights hummed overhead with the persistence of institutional indifference. Special Agent Marcus Webb, no relation to Victor's defense attorney, he'd clarified immediately, reviewed Rob's statement with the methodical attention of someone building a case that couldn't afford procedural mistakes. You're saying Victor Ashford framed you in 2002 using fabricated evidence and stolen credentials? Webb's tone carried no judgment, just the flat affect of someone who'd heard every variation of human deception and learned not to prejudge. Rob appreciated that neutrality even as exhaustion made his own voice rougher than intended. That's correct. Victor created unauthorized trades using my digital signature, established offshore accounts in my name. When I discovered his embezzlement and reported it internally, he triggered the frame before I could build my case. And you were arrested, but charges were eventually dismissed. Insufficient evidence to prosecute. But insufficient evidence isn't the same as innocence in the court of professional opinion. I was blacklisted, bankrupted by legal fees and settlements. My reputation never recovered. Webb made notes, his pen scratching across paper in an era when most agents used tablets. Until yesterday, when your daughter was kidnapped and Victor confessed to multiple felonies while police listened outside. That changes the calculus considerably. Does it change it enough? Rob leaned forward, needing Webb to understand the urgency beneath his question. Victor has resources, connections, 23 years building relationships with people who have power to make evidence disappear or investigations stall. I've watched him escape consequences before. Webb met his eyes with something that might have been respect. Mr. Brennan, I've been investigating financial crimes for 17 years. Victor Ashford has been on my radar for 5 of them, but he's always been too careful, too insulated. What happened last night was him making mistakes because he was angry and cornered. Those are the moments when we actually get them. So yes, it changes the calculus. This time he goes down. The door opened and Catherine entered with Sarah, who looked exhausted but steady. She'd given her own statement, been examined by paramedics, answered the same questions from different angles until the story had been documented from every perspective bureaucracy required. Now she moved to sit beside Rob with the deliberate control of someone holding herself together through discipline rather than actual stability. Webb addressed them both. Here's where we are. Victor Ashford is in custody, denied bail as flight risk given his financial resources and international connections. He's charged with kidnapping, attempted murder of Sarah Brennan, conspiracy to commit murder, witness, intimidation, and assault. Those are just the immediate charges. We're building additional cases around the financial fraud at Millennium Fund, which is now a priority investigation with full resources. What about his associates? The guard who held Sarah was killed, but Victor didn't act alone. Who else is involved? Webb flipped through his notes. We're identifying his network. Problem is, people like Victor insulate themselves through layers of deniability. Direct employees claim they were following orders without knowing the illegal nature. Shell companies hide beneficial ownership. This investigation will take months to unravel completely. Months. Sarah's voice carried frustration sharp enough to cut. How many more people lose money in Millennium Fund while you investigate? How many more lives get destroyed? We've frozen the fund's operations. No new investments, no withdrawals pending investigation. It's not perfect, but it prevents additional harm while we build the case. Rob understood the logic even as he shared Sarah's frustration. Building cases took time. Rushing prosecution led to acquittals on technicalities. But time also meant Victor's lawyers would be working equally hard, crafting defenses, finding procedural errors, preparing the counterattack that could still bury Rob and Sarah under litigation and public smears, even from behind bars. They left the FBI office as dawn painted Manhattan in shades of industrial gray. Catherine had her car waiting, offered them both rides home. Sarah declined. She wanted to walk, needed the movement to process everything that had happened. Rob understood, but worried anyway, the father in him, struggling against the knowledge that Sarah was an adult, capable of making her own decisions about recovery. Catherine drove Rob back to Queens through early morning traffic, neither speaking until they crossed into his neighborhood. Then she broke the silence with characteristic directness. Victor will fight this with everything he has. His legal team is already crafting narratives about overzealous prosecution, entrapment, illegal surveillance. They'll paint you as obsessed Sarah, as manipulated me, as opportunistic. It's going to get ugly before it gets better. I know. Rob watched familiar streets pass outside the window, small businesses opening for the day, people starting routines that didn't include federal investigations or kidnapping rescues. But for the first time in 23 years, I'm not fighting alone. That changes everything. Catherine pulled up outside Rob's building. We need to think about next steps. Webb's investigation focuses on criminal charges, but there's also civil liability, victim restitution, regulatory sanctions. This is going to be a multi-front war that lasts years. Are you prepared for that? I've been preparing for 23 years. The question is whether I have the resources to sustain it. That's where I come in. Catherine handed him a business card with a phone number handwritten on the back. Michael Torres. He's a senior policy advisor at the SEC now, but he taught at Wharton for 25 years before that. He was one of Sarah's professors. She's already reached out to him, and he's interested in reviewing the Millennium Fund evidence. Rob studied the card recognition clicking into place. Michael Torres had testified before Congress multiple times about financial regulation reform. His academic papers on fraud detection were foundational texts that Rob had studied decades ago. Having Torres involved would bring credibility and institutional weight that Rob could never command on his own. When does he want to meet tomorrow? Washington. Sarah's coming. Torres suggested you join us. Bring everything you've collected over the years. He wants to see the full pattern, not just recent evidence. Rob nodded, already mentally organizing files and documentation accumulated across years of obsessive investigation. Then he climbed out of Catherine's car and headed upstairs to his apartment, where he spent the next 8 hours digitizing everything he had: notes, photographs, financial analyses, timeline reconstructions, the entire architecture of Victor's crimes as Rob understood them. Sleep came in brief, fractured intervals. By the time Rob's alarm went off at 5 the next morning, he'd managed perhaps 3 hours of rest that did nothing to ease the exhaustion settling into his bones. But exhaustion was familiar. He could function through it. Had functioned through worse for longer. The train to Washington left Penn Station at 7:15. Sarah met him on the platform carrying her own laptop and files, moving with determination that masked whatever trauma she was processing internally. They found seats in a quiet car and spent the journey reviewing strategy, coordinating their presentations, making sure their separate investigations aligned into a coherent narrative. Sarah had worked the technical, financial analysis, valuations, cash flows, performance metrics that revealed Millennium Fund's reported returns diverged significantly from actual results. Rob had the historical context, Victor's patterns, his methods, the way his current fraud echoed in expanded techniques he'd used to destroy Rob 23 years earlier. Together, they had something approaching a complete picture. The SEC building in Washington projected institutional authority through architecture designed to intimidate. But Michael Torres's office was surprisingly modest: books, stacked on every surface, Whiteboards covered with equations, coffee cups in various stages of abandonment. Torres himself was 65 but moved with the energy of someone 20 years younger. His handshake firm and his attention immediately focused. Sarah, good to see you again, though I wish circumstances were different. And you must be Robert Brennan. Your daughter speaks highly of you. Torres gestured them to seats and spent the next 4 hours reviewing everything they'd brought. He asked pointed questions, challenged assumptions, tested their methodology with the rigor of someone who'd spent decades teaching students to think critically about financial data. By the time they finished, Torres had filled 3 whiteboards with notes and connections that expanded Rob's understanding of how deeply Victor's fraud extended. This is extraordinary work. Torres set down the final document and looked at them with something like admiration. If your analysis is accurate, and I believe it is, Millennium Fund is running a sophisticated Ponzi structure combined with asset inflation and fabricated performance. But that's just one vehicle. These shell companies you've identified suggest Victor has multiple operations running simultaneously. How many people are affected? Sarah asked the question Rob had been afraid to voice. Conservative estimate, 2,000 direct investors in Millennium Fund alone. Total capital at risk approaches $800 million. But if the connected entities are also fraudulent, we're looking at potential losses exceeding $2 billion. The numbers hit like physical force. $2 billion. Thousands of people. Retirement, savings, college funds, pension accounts, all destroyed by one man's greed and the system's failure to stop him, despite warnings that had been visible for years to anyone willing to look. Torres continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone delivering difficult truth. Building a case this size takes time. Minimum 6 months before formal charges, beyond what Victor already faces. Probably closer to a year before trial. During that time, Victor's lawyers will be attacking every aspect of your credibility, trying to get evidence, suppressed filing motions to dismiss. It's going to be brutal. Rob had expected this. Still hurt hearing it confirmed. Can we expedite? Not without risking the case falling apart on appeal. These investigations require meticulous documentation, coordination across multiple agencies, international cooperation for the offshore components. Rush it, and Victor walks on technicalities. Sarah leaned forward. What can we do to help? Keep documenting. Keep analyzing. Every piece of evidence strengthens the case. And prepare yourselves for retaliation. Victor's in custody, but his organization isn't. People who benefited from his schemes will fight to protect their own interests. They left Torres's office as afternoon faded into evening, catching the last train back to New York. Rob watched the landscape blur past his window suburbs, giving way to industrial zones, giving way to urban density, while his mind processed implications and strategies and the mounting weight of responsibility he'd taken on, not just for himself, but for Sarah, for Catherine, for the thousands of victims whose losses would define the remainder of their lives. The next 3 weeks established a rhythm that felt simultaneously urgent and glacial. Rob worked his consulting jobs during the day, maintaining the income stream that paid rent and bought food. Evenings and weekends, he collaborated with Sarah and Catherine, building documentation, tracing financial flows, identifying additional victims who could testify when trials began. Sterling Capital had fired Sarah officially for violating company policy by accessing confidential files, unofficially for embarrassing them by nearly walking into a massive fraud. She'd filed a wrongful termination lawsuit that would take years to resolve and probably settle for pennies on the dollar, but the principle mattered more than the money. Meanwhile, she worked as an independent consultant living on savings while dedicating most of her time to the investigation. Catherine's team expanded. She brought in forensic accountants, former federal prosecutors, investigators who specialized in white-collar crime. The operation exceeded her original budget by orders of magnitude, but Catherine absorbed costs with the determination of someone who'd finally found the story that might define her career. Rob appreciated her commitment, even as he worried about the financial risk she was taking. Victor remained in custody, but his lawyers were earning their substantial fees. They filed motion after motion, suppressed evidence from the warehouse rescue, arguing police lacked proper warrant, dismissed kidnapping charges, claiming Victor was elsewhere, and the guard acted independently. Challenged the SEC investigation as regulatory overreach. Most motions failed, but each one consumed time and resources, grinding down the prosecution through procedural attrition. Then 5 weeks after Sarah's rescue, Rob received a visitor at his apartment. He opened the door to find a woman in her early 40s, expensively dressed, carrying herself with the kind of controlled desperation that came from having exhausted easier options. Robert Brennan. Her voice was cultured, careful. "I'm Alexandra Ashford, Victor's wife. May I come in?" Rob's first instinct was refusal. But curiosity outweighed caution, and Alexandra didn't project threat so much as exhaustion. He stepped aside, letting her enter the small studio that suddenly felt even more cramped with a stranger inside. Alexandra looked around without judgment, then sat on the chair Rob offered. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I know what Victor did to you, what he's done to hundreds of people. I've known for years, though I didn't have proof, and I was too afraid to act. But he's in custody now, and I have an opportunity to make things right. Or at least less wrong. Why would you help me? Because Victor made a mistake. He thought marriage meant loyalty. But what he bought was complicity, and I'm done being complicit." Alexandra opened her purse and pulled out a small USB drive. This contains encryption keys to Victor's offshore servers. Every transaction he wanted hidden. Every communication he thought was secure. Everything you need to prove his fraud, absolutely. Rob stared at the drive, not touching it. "Why not give this to the FBI directly?" "Because I'm his wife. Everything I say will be viewed as bitter divorce strategy. Everything I provide will be questioned. But if you discover this information independently, it carries weight. I'm giving you the keys. How you use them is your decision. What do you get out of this freedom?" Victor's conviction means I can divorce without the prenuptial agreement triggering. It means I'm not liable for his debts or his crimes. It means I might actually survive this with something resembling a life. She stood, moving toward the door. "That's what I get. What you get is justice. Seems like a fair trade." Alexandra left before Rob could ask more questions. He held the USB drive, feeling its weight exceed its physical mass. If legitimate, this evidence could accelerate prosecution by months, maybe years. But accepting it meant trusting Victor's wife, someone who'd benefited from his crimes, even if she claimed ignorance of their full scope. Rob called Catherine. She arrived within the hour, brought a laptop isolated from any network, and opened the drive with the caution of someone who dealt with enough malware to know better than trust unknown files. But the drive was clean, just data, massive amounts of data, financial records going back 15 years, communications between Victor and co-conspirators, detailed accounting of how money flowed through shell companies and offshore accounts, video recordings of meetings where Victor and others discussed fraud schemes with casual bluntness that suggested they'd never imagined being held accountable. Catherine worked through the files for 3 hours while Rob watched over her shoulder. When she finally looked up, her expression carried vindication, tempered by grim professional assessment. "This is nuclear. If authentic and preliminary analysis suggests it is, this doesn't just prove Victor's guilt. It implicates dozens of others. Lawyers, accountants, bankers who facilitated the fraud. Politicians who took bribes to look the other way. This is going to destroy careers and send multiple people to prison." How long to verify authenticity? 2 weeks minimum. We need to cross-reference against known records, validate the encryption, confirm the metadata matches claimed dates. Can't afford to present evidence that gets challenged successfully at trial. Rob understood but felt the familiar frustration of moving slowly when urgency screamed for speed. Every day Victor remained free of additional charges was another day his lawyers worked to undermine the existing case. But Catherine was right, better to be slow and right than fast and wrong. They spent the next 2 weeks validating Alexandra's data. Forensic analysis confirmed authenticity. Records matched verifiable transactions. Communications included details only participants could have known. By the end of the second week, Catherine had built what she called an unimpeachable case evidence, so comprehensive that even Victor's lawyers would struggle to create reasonable doubt. Catherine scheduled a meeting with Webb and Torres, presenting the new evidence in a conference room that felt too small for the magnitude of what they were discussing. Webb's expression remained professionally neutral, but his questions became more pointed, more excited. Torres leaned back in his chair with the satisfaction of someone watching a theory proven spectacularly correct. When the presentation ended, Webb spoke first. "This changes everything. With this evidence, we can expand charges to include wire fraud, money laundering, racketeering. We can pursue RICO charges given the organized nature of the conspiracy. Victor's not just going to prison, he's going to die there. Torres nodded agreement. The SEC will file civil charges against everyone involved in facilitating the fraud. Asset freezes, trading bans, disgorgement of ill-gotten gains. We're going to bankrupt the entire network. Rob felt relief and something darker satisfaction that approached vindication, but didn't quite reach it because the cost had been too high, the time too long, the damage too permanent for simple justice to repair what Victor had broken. Sarah, present for the meeting via video conference from New York, asked the question Rob had been thinking. What about the victims, the people who lost everything in Millennium Fund? Webb's expression softened slightly. Victim restitution comes from seized assets. We're identifying everything Victor controlled, everything his co-conspirators hid. Conservative estimates suggest we'll recover 40% of losses. Not full compensation, but better than nothing. 40%. Rob did the math automatically. If total losses approach $2 billion, recovery would be around $800 million. That left $1,200 million in permanent losses. Families destroyed, retirements eliminated, dreams deferred or abandoned entirely because one man decided personal enrichment justified any amount of collateral damage. The meeting concluded with action items distributed. Webb would coordinate with Justice Department on expanded federal charges. Torres would lead the SEC civil case. Catherine would continue investigating to identify additional victims and assets. Rob and Sarah would prepare to testify when trials began, probably in 6 to 8 months. Rob returned to Queens that evening, feeling simultaneously victorious and hollow. He'd waited 23 years for this moment. Victor finally facing consequences, the system finally working justice, finally approaching something like served. But the hollowness came from understanding that justice wasn't redemption. It didn't restore what had been taken. It didn't give Rob back the years spent in exile or repair his broken marriage or resurrect the career he'd built before Victor destroyed it. Sarah called that night. Her voice carried exhaustion that matched Rob's own. Dad, is it weird that I don't feel happy Victor's going to prison? We won, but I just feel tired. Victory isn't always satisfying. Sometimes it's just the end of losing. They talked for an hour about nothing and everything: Sarah's job search, Rob's consulting clients, whether they should take a vacation somewhere warm when the immediate crisis passed. Normal conversation that felt precious because it wasn't about fraud or investigations or 23-year-old wounds that had finally stopped bleeding but would never fully heal. After hanging up, Rob sat in darkness watching headlights trace patterns across his ceiling. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. He almost ignored it, then opened it out of curiosity. The message contained a single photo, Victor in his cell looking diminished by orange jumpsuit and context. Below the image text, he looks smaller when he can't hurt people anymore, doesn't he? Thought you'd want to see. A. Alexandra. Rob stared at the photo, studying Victor's face for some sign of remorse or defeat. Found neither, just calculation. Victor was planning something, working angles, preparing his next move, even from custody, because that was who he'd always been, someone who saw obstacles as problems to solve through strategy and ruthlessness. Rob forwarded the photo to Catherine with a message: Victor's not done fighting. We need to stay vigilant. Her reply came immediately. Already on it. Sleep if you can. Tomorrow we start building the victim testimony database. Going to be a long few months. Rob didn't sleep. Instead, he organized his files, reviewed timelines, prepared for whatever challenges remained. Because Catherine was right, this was just beginning. The arrests were made, the evidence was documented, but trials took time, and outcomes were never guaranteed regardless of how strong the case appeared. Victor had escaped consequences before through money and connections and willingness to destroy anyone who challenged him. He'd try again. And Rob needed to be ready. Dawn found him still awake, still working, still preparing. The apartment smelled like old coffee and the particular staleness that came from too many hours in enclosed space without adequate ventilation. Rob showered, changed clothes, and headed out to meet his first consulting client of the Billionaire, a bodega owner who needed help understanding tax implications of expanding his business. Normal work, normal problems. The kind of small-scale financial questions that had defined Rob's professional life for 2 decades, helping people who would never make headlines or build empires, but whose livelihoods mattered just as much as any Fortune 500 CEOs. Rob found purpose in this work in the immediate tangible impact of helping someone understand their own numbers well enough to make informed decisions. By the time he finished his appointments and returned home, exhaustion had settled so deeply into his bones that he collapsed onto his bed fully clothed and slept for 12 hours straight. When he woke, the sun was rising again, and his phone showed 17 missed calls. Catherine Sarah Webb, Tora's numbers he didn't recognize. Rob called Catherine first. She answered before the first ring finished. "Where have you been? I've been trying to reach you for hours." "Sleeping." "What happened?" Victor's lawyers filed a motion to suppress all evidence from Alexandra's USB drive. They're claiming she had no legal right to access his private files, that accepting them makes us complicit in an illegal search, that everything on the drive is fruit of poison tree and inadmissible. Rob's stomach dropped. Can they win that argument? Webb says no, but it complicates things. We're going to have to fight this motion, which delays everything while courts decide. And it signals Victor's strategy. He's going to challenge every piece of evidence on procedural grounds, trying to get enough suppressed that the case becomes unprovable. How long will the motion take to resolve? Months. Maybe longer if it goes through appeals. Catherine's frustration bled through her professional composure. We finally have him, and he's going to drag this out until everyone's too exhausted to keep fighting. Then we don't get exhausted. We pace ourselves. We remember this is marathon, not sprint. Rob believed his own words even as he felt the weight of them. 23 years had taught him patience. He could sustain longer if necessary. They spent the next hour strategizing, planning responses to Victor's motion, identifying backup evidence that would hold even if Alexandra's drive was excluded. The work was tedious and technical, the kind of legal minutiae that determined outcomes but made terrible narratives. No dramatic courtroom moments, just paperwork and procedure grinding forward with agonizing slowness. Sarah joined them via video, contributing her own analysis. "Sterling's lawyers have been calling. They want to settle my wrongful termination suit, offering 2 years' salary plus benefits, continuation if I sign NDA about Millennium Fund investigation." Rob's immediate instinct was rejection. NDAs protected the powerful, silenced the truth. But he also understood Sarah needed income, needed stability, while the investigation consumed time she could have spent building her career. The decision was hers to make, and whatever she chose, Rob would support. "What do you want to do?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "I want to tell them to go to hell, but I also want to pay rent and eat food and not drain my savings to zero while we wait for trials that might take years. So I'm going to take their money and sign their NDA, and then I'm going to keep helping this investigation anyway, because their NDA covers Millennium Fund, but doesn't cover Victor's other schemes that we're still uncovering." Catherine smiled. "That's the loophole we can work with. Take their settlement. We'll structure your continued involvement around areas their NDA doesn't reach." They ended the call with action items and timelines, the machinery of long-term investigation clicking forward incrementally. Rob spent the remainder of the day working through victim testimonies that Catherine's team had collected, heartbreaking stories of families destroyed, retirements, eliminated dreams, abandoned, because Victor had stolen not just money, but the security and hope that money represented. Eleanor Martinez, 78, widow who'd invested her late husband's life insurance payout. William and Susan Chen, who'd lost their daughter's college fund. Marcus Williams, disabled veteran, whose VA benefits hadn't been enough after his Millennium Fund investment disappeared. On and on, hundreds of people whose primary crime had been trusting someone they shouldn't have trusted. Rob made a list, not for the investigation that was Catherine's domain, but a personal accounting of people he wanted to help directly once assets were recovered and restitution began. His own losses felt smaller in context of their suffering. He'd survived for 23 years on stubbornness and small victories. These people deserved more than survival. They deserved restoration, or whatever approximation of it remained possible. Evening found Rob back at his apartment, eating takeout Chinese food while reviewing financial projections for the Victim Restitution Fund. His phone rang, unknown number. Rob almost ignored it, but answered out of habit. Robert Brennan, male voice, professional, unfamiliar. "Speaking. This is Thomas Garrett, Victor Ashford's attorney. I'd like to propose a conversation. My client is willing to consider a plea agreement that might be beneficial for all parties involved." Rob's grip tightened on his phone. Tell Victor I'm not interested in deals. Mr. Brennan, please consider. My client faces significant prison time regardless of trial outcome. But trial will be long, expensive, traumatic for everyone involved, including you and your daughter. A plea agreement could expedite justice, guarantee conviction, and allow victim restitution to begin immediately rather than waiting years for appeals to exhaust. What's Victor offering? Guilty plea to reduce charges. 30 years in federal prison, no parole possibility. Immediate cooperation in identifying all assets for victim recovery. Testimony against co-conspirators. In exchange, prosecution drops RICO charges and recommends concurrent rather than consecutive sentencing. Rob thought through implications. 30 years meant Victor died in prison. He was 58, would be 88 at earliest release. Cooperation meant faster asset recovery and additional prosecutions. But reduced charges meant admitting the full scope of Victor's crimes couldn't be proven, and concurrent sentencing meant less total time than consecutive would impose. I need to discuss this with the prosecutors and my daughter. Of course, Garrett's voice carried rehearsed reasonableness. But Mr. Brennan, please consider that continued litigation keeps you trapped in this nightmare indefinitely. A plea agreement means closure, means you and Sarah can move forward with your lives. Surely that's worth something. Rob hung up without responding, then called Catherine, who called Webb, who called Torres. They conference called within 30 minutes, hashing through Victor's offer with the collective skepticism of people who'd seen too many supposed deals collapse into strategic traps. Webb's assessment was characteristically blunt. Victor's scared. His lawyers know the evidence is overwhelming. They're trying to minimize damage and control narrative. Taking this plea means Victor admits guilt publicly, but avoids some of the most serious charges that would guarantee he dies in prison. Does he die in prison with 30 years? Sarah asked. Probably, but probably isn't guaranteed. Medical parole, compassionate release, future sentencing reforms, there are variables. Consecutive sentencing on all charges would be more definitive. Torres added his perspective. From victim's standpoint, immediate asset recovery is significant. Every year this drags through trial and appeals is another year victims wait for restitution. Plea agreement accelerates that process considerably. Rob listened to arguments weighing justice against pragmatism, perfect outcomes against probable ones. Part of him wanted Victor to face every charge, receive maximum sentencing, spend every remaining day in prison, knowing the full weight of his crimes had been acknowledged. But another part, the part that had spent 23 years learning bitter lessons about how justice actually worked, understood that guaranteed conviction and faster restitution might matter more than symbolic totality. The conversation continued for 2 hours, circling arguments without resolution. Finally, Webb proposed a path forward. We tell Victor's lawyers we'll consider the plea, but with modifications. 40 years minimum consecutive on certain charges, cooperation with full transparency, including testimony at co-conspirator trials. Take it or leave it, everyone agreed. The counteroffer went back to Victor's lawyers, and then came the waiting days stretching into a week while negotiations happened, in language designed to obscure more than clarify lawyers earning fees by transforming simple concepts into Baroque contractual architecture. Rob continued his routines because routines were what kept him stable. Consulting work, victim testimony review, long conversations with Sarah about everything except the case, maintaining connection that wasn't entirely defined by shared trauma. Dinners with Catherine where they talked about normal things, books, movies, the absurd price of New York real estate, rebuilding identities that had been consumed by investigation for too long. Then Victor's lawyers responded. 35 years, some consecutive full cooperation testimony against co-conspirators, immediate asset disclosure. Take it or prosecution moves forward with every charge and no mercy. Webb called a final conference. This is probably the best offer we'll get. It guarantees conviction. It accelerates restitution. It puts Victor in prison until he's 93 years old, which is effectively life. I recommend we take it. Sarah's voice came through the line. I want to hear from my father first. Rob closed his eyes, feeling the weight of 23 years pressing down on this single decision. What he chose next would define how this chapter ended and the next began. Justice or closure? Perfect or good enough? The question had never been binary, but it felt that way in this moment. Take the deal. Rob opened his eyes, certainty settling into his voice. Victor spends the rest of his life in prison. Victims get restitution faster. Co-conspirators face prosecution. That's not perfect, but it's justice. Real justice. The kind that actually helps people instead of just satisfying my need for revenge. The agreement was signed within 48 hours. Victor pleaded guilty to fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, and kidnapping. 35 years in federal prison. No parole eligibility. Immediate cooperation with asset recovery and testimony against 17 co-conspirators who'd facilitated his schemes. The plea hearing was public, packed with media and victims who'd waited months to see Victor face consequences. Rob and Sarah sat in the front row watching Victor stand before the judge and admit to each charge with the mechanical delivery of someone following a script written by expensive lawyers. The judge, Margaret Harrison, 62, known for harsh sentencing in white-collar cases, accepted the plea, but made clear her contempt for both the crimes and the man who'd committed them. Mr. Ashford, you stole from thousands of people. You destroyed families. You betrayed every principle of fiduciary duty and basic human decency. Your cooperation and plea agreement have earned you consideration, but make no mistake, you will spend the rest of your life in federal custody, and that outcome is justice, not mercy. Marshals took Victor away in handcuffs. He didn't look at Rob or Sarah as he left, didn't acknowledge the victims whose lives he'd destroyed. Just walked out with the same cold detachment he'd probably felt when making decisions that ruined them, as if human suffering was merely data to be optimized around rather than consequence to be considered. Outside the courthouse, media swarmed. Rob declined interviews. Sarah declined interviews. Catherine gave a brief statement thanking law enforcement and promising that the investigation would continue until every person involved faced appropriate consequences. Then they escaped to Catherine's car and drove away from the circus back towards something resembling normal life that none of them quite knew how to reconstruct. The federal courthouse in Manhattan projected authority through limestone and brass, its architecture designed in an era when institutions still commanded reflexive respect. 8 months after Victor's plea agreement, the co-conspirator trials began with the kind of media attention that turned procedural justice into public spectacle. Rob sat in the gallery watching prosecutors methodically dismantle the defense of Gerald Hutchins, Victor's former CFO, and the first domino in what would become 17 separate prosecutions. Hutchins looked diminished in his defendant's chair, the confidence that came from managing hundreds of millions of dollars stripped away by handcuffs and reality. His lawyer argued he'd been deceived by Victor, manipulated into facilitating fraud he didn't understand. The prosecution countered with emails Hutchins had written, video of meetings where he'd laughed about deceiving investors' bank records, showing his personal enrichment through kickbacks and shell company payments. The jury deliberated for 6 hours, guilty on all counts. Hutchins would join Victor in federal prison, his sentence not yet determined, but guaranteed to exceed a decade. 16 more trials would follow the same pattern over the next year, co-conspirators claiming ignorance or coercion, while evidence revealed knowing participation and personal profit. Rob attended every trial he could manage around his consulting work. Sarah came when her schedule allowed, but she'd started rebuilding her career as an independent financial analyst, advising small firms on risk assessment and due diligence. The wrongful termination settlement from Sterling Capital had provided cushion, but Sarah was someone who needed purpose through work, and she'd found it helping companies avoid the mistakes that had nearly destroyed her former employer. Catherine's investigation had expanded beyond Victor's network to examine systematic failures that had allowed the fraud to persist for years. Regulatory agencies that missed obvious warning signs. Auditors who signed off on questionable valuations. Banks that processed suspicious transactions without adequate scrutiny. Her findings would eventually become a book, The Millennium Fraud, How One Man Stole $2 billion while everyone looked away. That would spend 14 weeks on bestseller lists and spark congressional hearings about financial regulation reform. But those outcomes were still months away. In the present moment, Rob focused on victims. The asset recovery process had begun, federal marshals seizing properties and accounts, forensic accountants tracing money through international banking systems designed to hide it. Early estimates suggested total recovery would reach $900 million, better than initial projections, but still less than half of total losses. Rob had started a nonprofit, the Brennan Restitution Fund, using what little savings he had left, plus donations from people who'd followed the case and wanted to help. The fund supplemented federal restitution for the most desperate cases, providing immediate assistance while bureaucratic processes ground forward. Eleanor Martinez received enough to keep her home. The Chen family got their daughter enrolled in college with scholarship help. Marcus Williams had medical equipment purchased that VA benefits didn't cover. Small victories that didn't compensate for the scope of destruction, but mattered enormously to the individuals helped. Rob worked the fund full-time, now having transitioned his consulting clients to other accountants. At 63, he'd found purpose that felt more meaningful than anything he'd done in his previous career, back when success was measured in assets under management rather than lives tangibly improved. Sarah visited his apartment on a Saturday afternoon, bringing lunch from the Thai place they both liked. She'd cut her hair shorter, professional style, that matched her new role as someone other financial analysts consulted for expertise. Pride swelled in Rob's chest, watching his daughter rebuild so thoroughly, transforming trauma into authority that clients trusted and competitors respected. They ate in comfortable silence. Initially, then Sarah set down her fork with the deliberateness that signaled serious conversation approaching. Dad, I've been thinking about what comes next, after the trials conclude, after victim restitution finishes processing. What do you want for yourself? Rob considered the question while chewing pad thai, giving himself time to formulate honest answer. I want to keep doing what I'm doing, helping people. The fun matters, not just because it provides money, but because it shows victims someone cares about their specific suffering, not just the aggregate statistics. That's not really about you, though. That's about them. What do you want for your own life? The distinction hit harder than Sarah probably intended. Rob had spent so long defining himself through opposition to victim, seeking justice, investigator, pursuing the truth, advocate for the destroyed, that he'd forgotten how to conceptualize identity independent of that conflict. Now that Victor was imprisoned and the legal machinery was processing consequences, who was Robert Brennan, beyond the man who'd been wronged and had finally achieved vindication? I don't know. Rob met his daughter's eyes, admitting uncertainty that felt vulnerable. For 23 years, I've been focused on one thing: exposing Victor, getting justice. And now that it's happening, there's this void where purpose used to be. The fun helps fill it, but you're right, that's external. I don't know what I want for myself because I've forgotten how to think that way. Sarah reached across the table and squeezed his hand. Maybe that's the work now. Figuring out who you are when you're not defined by what was taken from you. Building something new instead of just recovering what was lost. Her words resonated in ways Rob would think about for weeks afterward, turning them over during sleepless nights and long walks through Queens neighborhoods that had become home through years of exile. Who was he beyond victim and advocate? What did he want beyond justice? The questions felt simultaneously simple and impossible, the kind of existential inquiry that people usually confronted earlier in life. But Rob had deferred because survival demanded more immediate focus. The trials continued through summer into fall. Convictions accumulated, CFOs and lawyers and accountants who'd facilitated Victor's schemes now facing their own prison sentences. Asset recovery accelerated as co-conspirators disclosed hidden accounts in exchange for reduced sentencing. By October, total recovered assets exceeded $1 billion, meaning victims would receive approximately 50 cents on the dollar for their losses. Not full restitution, but better than anyone had projected initially. Rob attended victims' meetings where federal administrators explained the complex formula determining individual payouts based on investment timing and loss documentation. Some victims were satisfied. Others remained angry that they'd never fully recover. All of them carried permanent scars from the experienced financial trauma that would shape their remaining years, regardless of how much money eventually returned. Eleanor Martinez approached Rob after one such meeting, moving slowly with the careful deliberation of someone whose bones hurt constantly. Mr. Brennan, I wanted to thank you again for the fund, for never giving up. My husband always said the most important thing in life was persistence. You proved him right. Your husband sounds like he was a wise man. He was. Eleanor's eyes grew distant with memory. We were married 53 years, built everything together. And then he did, and Victor stole what we'd built, and I thought that was the end. But you fought back. You showed me that endings aren't always final. Sometimes there's another chapter if you're brave enough to write it. She shuffled away before Rob could respond, leaving him standing in the community center, where the meeting had been held, surrounded by dozens of other victims whose conversations created white noise that Rob barely heard. Eleanor's words echoed instead. Endings aren't always final. Sometimes there's another chapter if you're brave enough to write it. Rob had spent 23 years writing one chapter, the long arc from destruction through exile toward justice. That chapter was concluding, now trials winding down, restitution processing, Victor imprisoned until death released him from consequences. But Eleanor was right. Conclusions created space for new beginnings, if Rob could figure out what he wanted that beginning to be. He left the community center and walked to the subway, taking trains that carried him not home, but to Manhattan, to the building where Brennan and Associates had once occupied the 47th floor. The company was long gone, replaced by some tech startup whose employees were probably younger than Rob had been when he'd founded the firm. He stood on the sidewalk, looking up at windows that reflected clouds and sky, remembering the person he'd been back then, confident, ambitious, certain that hard work and integrity guaranteed success. That person seemed impossibly naive from current perspective, but also admirable in ways Rob had forgotten. The younger Robert Brennan had believed deeply in principles that subsequent experience had tested but not broken. He'd been wrong about how easily virtue triumphed, but right about virtue mattering. 23 years of suffering had taught him that lesson more thoroughly than success ever could have. Rob's phone rang, Catherine's name on the screen. He answered while still staring up at the building that represented everything he'd lost and everything he'd been. Rob, where are you? You sound like you're outside, Manhattan. Standing in front of my old office building, having a midlife crisis 20 years too late. Catherine laughed, the sound carrying genuine warmth. Well, when you're done with your crisis, come to Brooklyn. I have someone who wants to meet you, says it's important, who didn't give a name, just said he's a financial analyst who found irregularities in a case he's working and heard you might be able to help. Sounded young, scared, reminded me of how Sarah sounded when she first called about Millennium Fund. Rob felt something shift in his chest, not quite hope, but adjacent to it. Another young analyst finding fraud and looking for guidance. Another opportunity to help someone avoid the isolation Rob had experienced or support them through it if avoidance wasn't possible. Maybe this was the answer to Sarah's question about what came next. Not a single grand purpose, but a series of smaller ones, helping people one at a time, building cumulative impact through repeated action. Give me 40 minutes. I'm on my way. Catherine's office in Brooklyn had expanded since the investigation began, now occupying an entire floor with multiple conference rooms and staff who coordinated ongoing cases. She'd become something of a celebrity in investigative circles, the journalist turned investigator who'd helped bring down one of the largest financial frauds in history. But success hadn't changed her essential nature, still skeptical, still thorough, still committed to work that mattered more than work that paid. She met Rob at reception and led him to a conference room where a young man waited. Asian American, late 20s, wearing the kind of slightly rumpled business casual that suggested he'd come straight from work without time to prepare. His hand shook slightly as he stood to shake Rob's hand, nervous energy barely contained. Mr. Brennan, my name is David Chen. I work as an analyst at Highland Investment Partners. 3 weeks ago, I found discrepancies in a fund we're considering for client portfolios. My supervisor told me to ignore them. But the patterns, they look exactly like what I've read about Millennium Fund. I think Highland is either running a fraud or about to invest clients in one, and I don't know what to do. Rob sat down across from David, recognizing himself at 29 in the frightened analyst's face. Tell me everything. Start from the beginning. Take your time. And David, you did the right thing by coming forward. That takes courage that most people don't have. Over the next 2 hours, David explained what he'd found: inflated valuations, irregular cash flows, performance returns that diverged from underlying asset reality. The patterns were familiar variations on themes Rob had seen in Victor's fraud and in the academic literature about financial crime that he'd studied obsessively. Highland wasn't as sophisticated or large-scale as Millennium Fund, but the basic architecture was similar enough to raise serious concerns. Catherine took notes, asking technical questions that helped clarify details. Rob focused on David himself, reading body language, assessing credibility, determining whether this was legitimate whistleblowing or something else. By the end, Rob was convinced David was genuine a good analyst, who'd stumbled into wrongdoing and had the integrity to report it despite professional risk. What happens if I report this formally? David's voice carried the fear Rob remembered feeling. Do I lose my job? Get blacklisted? Spend years fighting while everyone calls me crazy? Probably yes to all of that. Rob didn't soften the truth because softening it would be dishonest. Whistleblowing is hard. The system is supposed to protect you, but protection is imperfect and retaliation is subtle. You'll be isolated, questioned, doubted. Your career trajectory will change permanently. But David, the alternative, is being complicit in fraud that hurts people. That's not something you can undo later. David sat quietly processing. Then he straightened slightly, decision visible in his posture. I can't be complicit. I grew up in a family that lost everything in 2008 when my parents' investments collapsed. I became a financial analyst because I wanted to help people avoid that experience. If I ignore this, I'm part of the problem. So tell me what to do, I'll do it. Rob felt pride and grief simultaneously, pride that David had the courage to act, grief that acting required such courage in a system that should make ethical choices easier rather than professionally suicidal. But this was the reality they inhabited, and Rob could help navigate it based on hard lessons learned. First, document everything. Catherine will help you build files that can withstand legal challenge. Second, we find allies, SEC contacts, federal prosecutors, journalists who can investigate independently. Third, we protect you as much as possible, which won't be perfect, but we can minimize some damage. Fourth, Rob met David's eyes. You prepare yourself mentally for a long fight. This isn't quick or easy, but it's right, and that matters more than convenient. They worked until midnight, Rob and Catherine guiding David through initial steps, building the foundation for an investigation that would probably take years to resolve fully. When David finally left exhausted but determined, Rob remained in the conference room with Catherine, both too wired to sleep despite the late hour. This is going to keep happening, isn't it? Catherine poured coffee from the pot that had been brewing since dinner. We exposed Victor. We're exposing his co-conspirators. But there are hundreds of other Victors out there running similar schemes and dozens of young analysts like David who find them and don't know what to do. Rob accepted the coffee even though caffeine at midnight guaranteed insomnia. Then we help them, one at a time. Build networks and resources so the next David or Sarah has better support than I had 23 years ago. Maybe that's the real legacy here, not just punishing one criminal, but creating infrastructure that makes future crimes harder to sustain. Catherine smiled, tired but genuine. That sounds like purpose, Rob. Sounds like the beginning of another chapter. The phrase echoed Eleanor Martinez's words from earlier, the pattern of repetition making Rob think maybe the universe was trying to tell him something. Or maybe he was just old enough and tired enough that themes started seeming profound when they were merely coincidental. Either way, the path forward felt clearer. Use the experience and expertise earned through suffering to help others avoid similar suffering or endure it less alone. Over the following months, a pattern emerged. Rob worked with Catherine's firm as a consultant specifically focused on supporting financial whistleblowers. His title was something bureaucratic, senior advisor for ethical compliance, but the actual work was simpler. Young analysts found fraud. They contacted Catherine. Rob talked them through implications and options. Together, they built cases and coordinated with authorities and tried to protect people who'd chosen integrity over safety. Not every case was Millennium Fund level fraud. Most were smaller inflated valuations, unauthorized trades, misrepresentation of risk. But aggregated impact still mattered, still hurt people, still demanded challenge regardless of whether media would ever care. Rob found satisfaction in the work that he'd never felt in his previous career, even during the successful years before Victor's betrayal. Sarah noticed the change when they met for dinner at the Thai restaurant that had become their regular spot. You seem different, Dad, more settled, like you figured something out. Maybe I have. Rob considered how to articulate the shift he'd felt. For 23 years, I was defined by what Victor took from me. My career, my reputation, my future. Getting justice was about reclaiming those things, or at least proving they'd been taken unjustly. But working with David and the others, Catherine's been sending my way, that's not about reclaiming. That's about building something new. Using the experience for purpose instead of just vindication. That sounds healthy, Sarah's tone carried approval mixed with relief. "I've been worried about you. What happens when the trials conclude and restitution finishes? I didn't want you to lose purpose because the fight was over." "The fight's not over," Rob smiled slightly. "It just changed form. There's always another Victor, another David, another person who needs help navigating the choice between comfortable silence and difficult truth. I can't fight all those battles, but I can help prepare people for them, share what I learned, maybe spare them some of the mistakes I made." They finished dinner and walked through Brooklyn together, a conversation flowing easily between topics serious and mundane. Sarah talked about a client who'd hired her to evaluate a potential merger. Rob described David's case, which was developing evidence of systematic fraud at Highland Investment Partners. Neither mentioned Victor directly, though his shadow remained present in everything they discussed, the way formative trauma always lingered even after healing progressed. At the subway station where they'd part ways, Sarah hugged Rob tightly. "I'm proud of you, Dad, not just for getting justice, but for what you're doing with it. Turning pain into purpose. That's harder than revenge. Revenge was never really possible anyway." Rob returned the embrace, grateful for his daughter's presence in ways he struggled to articulate. Victor's in prison, but that doesn't undo what he did. Doesn't restore the years or the people or the trust. But helping others, that creates something new. Something he can't touch or take away. They separated, each heading to their respective homes through the subway system that connected New York's boroughs with democratic indifference to wealth or status. Rob emerged in Queens, walked familiar streets to his apartment building, climbed 3 flights to the studio that remained small, but felt less like exile now and more like chosen simplicity. His laptop showed new emails. One from the SEC confirming David's allegations had triggered formal investigation. One from a victim asking about restitution timeline. One from a journalist requesting interview about Victor's sentencing, hearing scheduled for next month. Rob answered them methodically, maintaining the organized responsiveness that had always been his professional strength. Then he opened a document he'd been working on for weeks, a guide for financial whistleblowers, synthesizing everything he'd learned into practical advice for analysts who found themselves where he'd been in 2002. The document covered technical aspects like evidence documentation and legal protections, but also psychological dimensions, how to maintain integrity when isolated, how to sustain commitment when outcomes remained uncertain, how to process trauma while continuing to function professionally. Rob wrote until exhaustion made the words blur, then saved the document and prepared for bed. Sleep came easier now than it had in years, the insomnia that had plagued him for decades finally easing, as purpose replaced anxiety. He dreamed occasionally about the past courtrooms and confrontations and moments of victory or defeat, but the dreams carried less emotional weight, as if memory was filing them away as complete rather than ongoing. Victor's sentencing hearing arrived on a Tuesday morning in late autumn. The courtroom was packed with victims and media, everyone wanting to witness the final chapter of the formal justice process. Rob and Sarah sat together in the second row, close enough to observe everything without being centerpiece of attention that had exhausted them both during the trials. Victor entered in prison jumpsuit, looking significantly older than the 58 years he'd lived. Incarceration-aged people stripped away the maintenance and privilege that had kept him artificially youthful. His hair was entirely gray now, face gaunt, movements stiff with the tension of someone who'd learned prison hierarchies the hard way. Judge Margaret Harrison reviewed the case with methodical thoroughness, noting the plea agreement, but retaining discretion within its parameters. The prosecution recommended 35 years consecutive on major charges. Defense argued for concurrent sentencing and credit for cooperation. Victim impact statements consumed 2 hours. Eleanor Martinez, the Chen family, Marcus Williams, and dozens of others describing in precise detail how Victor's greed had destroyed their security and dreams. Rob wasn't called to give impact statement, but he'd submitted written testimony that the judge had reviewed. When Harrison finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone passing judgment that would define the remainder of Victor's life. "Mr. Ashford, the scope of your crimes is extraordinary. You stole from thousands of people over decades. You showed no remorse until capture was inevitable, and even your cooperation was transactional rather than genuinely penitent. The plea agreement constrains my sentencing to some degree, but within those constraints, I impose maximum consequences. 35 years in federal prison, consecutive sentencing on counts 1 through 7, concurrent on remainder. no parole eligibility, restitution in full amount of provable losses. You will spend your remaining years in custody, and that outcome is appropriate and just. Harrison's gavel struck. Marshals approached Victor, who stood slowly accepting the finality with blank expression that revealed nothing. As they led him from the courtroom, he passed Rob's row. Their eyes met for perhaps 3 seconds, long enough for Rob to see that Victor still felt no genuine remorse, just resentment at being caught. Then he was gone, disappeared into the federal prison system, where he'd remain until death released him from consequences that had taken 2 decades to manifest. Outside the courthouse, Rob declined media interviews, but spoke briefly with victims who wanted to thank him. Eleanor Martinez hugged him with surprising strength. The Chen family bowed formally, honor culture expressing gratitude. Rob felt he didn't fully deserve. Marcus Williams shook his hand with the solid grip of someone who'd served in military and understood persistence. Sarah navigated them through the crowd to Catherine's car, and they drove away from the courthouse toward Brooklyn, where Catherine had organized small gathering, not celebration exactly, but acknowledgement that a long struggle had reached meaningful conclusion. The gathering included Webb and Torres, both of whom had become friends through the investigation. Alex Chen from Catherine's team. David Chen, no relation to Alex, but bonded by shared surname and commitment to exposing financial crime. They ate catered food and drank wine and talked about everything except Victor, collectively deciding that he'd consumed enough of their time and attention. Instead, they discussed David's case, which was developing into potentially larger scandal than Highland initially suggested. They talked about Sarah's growing reputation as the analyst who'd exposed Millennium Fund, how that was drawing clients who wanted someone with proven integrity. They talked about Catherine's book and the congressional hearings it had sparked, and whether actual regulatory reform might emerge from the attention. As evening faded into night, people drifted away until only Rob, Sarah, and Catherine remained. They sat in comfortable silence, exhausted but satisfied, until Sarah checked her watch and announced she needed to catch the last train home. Rob walked her to the subway station, the ritual they'd developed over months of coordinating around investigations and trials and the gradual reconstruction of their relationship beyond shared trauma. At the turnstile, Sarah paused before swiping her Metro card. "Dad, what you said about purpose and helping others, I've been thinking about it. And I want to be involved, not just with my own work, but with what you're building. The guide for whistleblowers, the restitution fund, the support network. I want to help build that infrastructure so the next generation has better resources than we did." Rob felt emotion tighten his throat. "I'd like that. We could make it a real organization, formalize what we've been doing informally, create something that outlasts us." Sarah smiled. "The Brennan Foundation has a nice ring to it." She disappeared into the subway. Rob stood on the platform watching the tunnel swallow the train, then turned and walked back toward Catherine's office, where she'd offered him couch space rather than making him travel to Queens this late. The city moved around him with the ceaseless energy that defined New York, regardless of hour cabs and delivery trucks, late workers and early partiers, the collision of lives and purposes that created urban density. Rob's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. He almost ignored it, but curiosity made him check. The message contained single image, Victor's mugshot from federal processing, looking defeated and old. Below it, simple text, "He's never getting out. You won. A. Alexandra Ashford, checking in one final time." Rob stared at the image for long moments, studying Victor's face for meaning or emotion or anything beyond exhaustion. Found nothing that satisfied. Winning didn't feel how he'd imagined during 23 years of anticipating. More like conclusion than triumph. More like door closing on long nightmare than door opening on renewed dream. But maybe that was appropriate. Revenge fantasies promised catharsis that reality rarely delivered. What mattered wasn't emotional satisfaction from Victor's imprisonment, but practical impact: victims receiving restitution, co-conspirators facing prosecution systems, improving to prevent future fraud, young analysts getting support when they found wrongdoing. Rob deleted the text and continued walking New York's lights, painting his path through neighborhoods that had become home, not despite exile, but through it. At Catherine's office, she'd already set up the couch with sheets and pillow-left bottle of water on the side table. Rob settled in but didn't sleep immediately, instead staring at the ceiling and processing the day's conclusion. Victor would die in prison. The thought carried weight that took time to fully comprehend. The man who destroyed Rob's career and stolen 23 years of life would spend his remaining decades in federal custody isolated from the luxury and power that had defined his identity. Justice, if imperfect, accountability, if delayed. Tomorrow, Rob would return to his apartment, to his consulting work, to the whistleblower support program he was building with Sarah and Catherine. The rhythm of normal life that he'd fought so hard to reclaim, while simultaneously learning that normal life wasn't what he'd lost, but what he was building anew from different materials. He wasn't the same person who had founded Brennan and Associates at 35. Couldn't be. 23 years of suffering and persistence had fundamentally altered him in ways both damaging and strengthening. But maybe that was okay. Maybe transformation was the point, not restoration. Maybe the goal wasn't recovering who he'd been, but becoming who experience had shaped him to be someone who understood fraud and trauma and institutional failure, someone who could help others navigate those realities, someone whose scars had become qualifications rather than just wounds. Sleep came eventually, deep and dreamless. When Rob woke to morning light filtering through Catherine's office windows, he felt rested in ways that transcended physical rest. The weight that had pressed on his chest for 23 years had lifted not completely, but enough that breathing came easier. Movement felt lighter, the future appeared less like burden and more like possibility. He made coffee in Catherine's break room, checked emails on his phone, responded to 3 new potential whistleblowers who'd reached out overnight. The work continued, would always continue. But that was fine. Rob had never wanted retirement in the traditional sense, just purpose that mattered beyond profit. Now he had it. Sarah called around 9. "Hey Dad, I've been thinking about the foundation. What if we structured it as combination of direct victim support, whistleblower resources, and educational programming? Teach financial analysts how to recognize fraud early, give them tools to report it safely, create community so they're not isolated when they come forward." Rob listened to his daughter outline vision that exceeded what he'd imagined, alone felt pride that she'd inherited not just his analytical skills, but his commitment to using those skills for something beyond self-interest. "That sounds perfect. Let's start building it." They talked for an hour, sketching organizational structure and funding strategies and timeline for launch. The conversation had the energy of beginning something rather than concluding something, the forward momentum that had been missing while Victor's trials consumed attention. By the time they hung up, Rob felt certain of path ahead, even if specific details remained unclear. The months that followed brought that certainty into form. The Brennan Foundation for Financial Ethics launched officially in spring, funded by a combination of Rob's remaining savings, Sarah's contribution donations from victims who wanted to prevent others from experiencing similar suffering, and grants from institutions interested in fraud prevention. Catherine joined the board. Torres signed on as advisor. Webb helped navigate regulatory requirements. They hired staff victim advocates, legal counselors, investigative researchers, established hotline for whistleblowers to report concerns anonymously, created educational materials that universities began incorporating into finance curricula, published quarterly reports on fraud trends and prevention strategies that industry publications cited and regulators noticed. The work was demanding but sustainable, the kind of long-term project that gave structure without consuming identity. Rob found balance between professional commitment and personal life that had eluded him during his first career, when success had meant endless hours and relationships subordinated to ambition. Now he worked hard, but also took walks, read books unrelated to finance, had dinners with Sarah where they talked about her dating life and his attempt to learn piano at 64, and whether either of them would ever stop finding quarters behind couch cushions. Eleanor Martinez invited Rob to her 80th birthday party. The Chen family sent their daughter's college graduation announcement with note thanking Rob for making her education possible. Marcus Williams dropped by the foundation office, periodically volunteering to help organize files or stuff envelopes, needing the connection and purpose that the organization provided as much as any formal role. 2 years after Victor's sentencing, Rob received a letter from federal prison. The return address showed it came from Victor himself. Rob almost threw it away unopened, but curiosity won. He sat at his kitchen table reading words written in handwriting that looked older and shakier than Victor's had been. "Robert, I'm writing because I have terminal liver cancer. 6 months, maybe less. I've spent 2 years in here thinking about what I did. Not because I've become better person prison doesn't work that way, but because death makes you honest about who you were when you thought you'd live forever. I destroyed you because I was afraid. You represented everything I wanted to be, but knew I couldn't achieve through legitimate means. Your integrity was mirror showing my corruption. So I eliminated the mirror instead of fixing myself. 23 years you suffered because of my fear. Thousands of people lost their futures because of my greed. I can't undo any of it. Can't even claim I'm sorry in the way that matters because sorry doesn't restore what I took. But I wanted you to know you won, not just legally. You won by staying true to yourself despite everything I did to break you. I had wealth power status. Wasn't enough. Never enough. You had integrity. That's everything. I'm dying in prison. You're building something meaningful. That's justice. Real justice. Not just punishment, but proof that character matters more than cleverness. I don't expect forgiveness. Just wanted you to know I finally understand what you tried to teach me 25 years ago before I destroyed us both. Victor Robb read the letter 3 times looking for manipulation or angle, or some final attempt to extract sympathy. Found only exhaustion and something that might have been genuine remorse, though distinguishing authentic regret from performative contrition remained impossible when the source was someone who'd spent decades lying professionally. He showed the letter to Sarah over dinner that evening. She read it silently, then set it down. Do you believe him? Parts of it. Robb chose words carefully. I think he's genuinely dying and that's made him reflective. Whether the reflection produced real understanding or just articulate self-justification, I don't know. Maybe both. People are complicated even when they're terrible. Are you going to respond? Robb had already decided, no, Victor's seeking something from me and I don't have it to give. Forgiveness isn't transaction where he confesses and I absolve. He did what he did, I survived it. That's complete. Adding another chapter now wouldn't serve either of us. Sarah nodded acceptance. Then she raised her wine glass. To moving forward instead of looking back. They touched glasses, the sound clear and final. Robb didn't mention Victor's letter again, filed it away in box with other documents from the case that he occasionally reviewed but didn't dwell on. 3 months later, he received notification that Victor had died in federal medical facility liver cancer, taking him at age 61. No funeral was held, no obituary appeared. Victor's third mind had divorced him while he was imprisoned, remarried, wanted no association with his name. His estate, what little remained after asset seizures and victim restitution, went to a court-appointed administrator to handle final claims. Robb felt no satisfaction from the death, just closure. Victor's story was finished. Robb's continued. The foundation grew. By its 5th year, it had helped 17 whistleblowers report fraud totaling $3 billion, provided direct assistance to 800 victims, trained 15,000 financial analysts in ethical compliance practices. Sarah had become executive director, handling operations, while Robb focused on direct victim support and whistleblower counseling. Catherine remained board member while expanding her investigative firm. Torres had retired from SEC, but consulted regularly. Robb turned 70 with small celebration that doubled his foundation fundraiser. He kept his studio apartment in Queens, refusing to upgrade despite financial stability from foundation salary and careful management of his modest needs. The space fit him simple, functional, defined by what it contained rather than how it appeared. He dated occasionally over the years, nothing serious but pleasant companionship that reminded him he was still capable of connection beyond professional relationships. A librarian named Susan who liked mystery novels and Thai food. A retired teacher named Patricia who volunteered at the foundation and made him laugh with stories about her grandchildren. Relationships that enriched without demanding additions rather than replacements for the life he'd built. Sarah married David Chen, the whistleblower Robb had helped in the case that started his formal involvement with the foundation. They'd worked together on investigations, discovered complementary strengths, fell in love with the practical ease of people who'd seen each other at their worst and stayed anyway. Robb walked Sarah down the aisle feeling bittersweet emotion, joy at her happiness, grief that her mother wasn't there to see it, gratitude that they'd both survived everything that could have destroyed them. At the reception, Eleanor Martinez approached Robb with walker and smile that had survived despite everything. Mr. Brennan, I wanted to tell you something. I'm 91 years old now, outlived my husband by 17 years. And you know what kept me going? Knowing that people like you exist. People who fight for what's right, even when it costs everything. That's the real wealth character that sustains when circumstances fail. She touched his arm gently, then moved away to find her seat. Rob stood alone for a moment, watching Sarah dance with David, watching victims and whistleblowers and advocates who'd become community through shared commitment to something larger than individual success. This was the legacy that mattered, not money or reputation or career accolades, but the network of people connected by belief that integrity wasn't weakness, but strength, that fighting for others mattered as much as fighting for yourself. That justice delayed wasn't justice denied if you kept working until it arrived. Rob's phone buzzed with text from unknown number. He almost ignored it, assuming spam or wrong number. But something made him check. The message contained single line. The work continues. New generation carrying forward what you started. Thank you. A former whistleblower you'll never meet. Rob smiled and pocketed his phone. The work did continue, would continue long after he was gone. That was the point. Building something that outlasted individual contributions, that became self-sustaining through shared values rather than depending on any single person's effort. He rejoined the reception, danced with Sarah and several elderly victims who insisted, despite their various physical limitations, toasted the couple with wine and words about persistence and love and the courage required to build life honestly in a dishonest world. The celebration lasted into evening, and people departing gradually until only core group remained: Sarah and David, Catherine Torres Webb, a dozen others who'd become family through battle rather than blood. They sat outside under string lights, sharing stories and silence in equal measure. Someone asked Rob what he'd learned from everything that had happened. He considered the question seriously before answering. I learned that justice is process, not event. That character is built through how you respond to hardship, not how you handle success. That helping others is more sustaining than achieving personal vindication. And that endings are always beginnings if you're brave enough to write the next chapter instead of rereading the last one. The words resonate through the group, people nodding recognition. Then Catherine raised her glass. To Robert Brennan, who taught us that persistence matters more than perfection, that integrity survives when everything else fails, and that the best revenge isn't defeating your enemy, but building something they could never destroy. Everyone drank. Rob felt tears sting his eyes but didn't hide them. These people had seen him at his lowest and stayed, had believed him when nobody else would, had helped him transform suffering into purpose. That was wealth that couldn't be stolen or lost or devalued by market forces. It was permanent and real and enough. The party concluded near midnight. People said goodbyes and scattered to their homes across New York and beyond. Rob took subway back to Queens, walked familiar streets to his building, climbed 3 flights to an apartment that held everything he needed and nothing he didn't. Before sleeping, he opened his laptop and wrote final entry in journal he'd kept throughout the investigation and foundation building. The entry was simple. Victor is dead. Justice is served. The work continues. I am content. He saved the file, closed the laptop, and went to bed. Sleep came easily, dreamless and deep, the rest of someone who'd fought long war and finally achieved peace, not through victory alone, but through transformation of the battlefield itself. Outside his window, New York continued its eternal motion. Inside, Rob rested. And in the morning, he'd wake to continue work that mattered, surrounded by people who cared, building. Legacy measured not in dollars, but in lives improved, and systems changed, and young analysts who'd faced corruption with better tools than he'd had, better support, better chance of emerging intact. That was enough. More than enough. Everything that mattered.